All good. How's everyone doing tonight? Who has been to our last symposium? We held one a few months ago, just before Stand Firm. Who came along to that one? Voting Journal. All right, at least half the crowd. And I imagine among the rest of the group here tonight, for a lot of you, this is probably your first symposium. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Haddon Institute. I think that most of the faces I see have had some interaction with the Institute at some point. A lot of people have been students here, taken some of our elective classes, some of our introduction classes, and of course a lot of our master's students are here tonight. So it really is a pleasure to be able to address you on this extremely enjoyable subject for myself. That is, of course, the larger theme is Charles Spurgeon. Anyone who knows me knows that's going to be a very delightsome subject for me. But even at a more narrow level, the topic of Charles Spurgeon and his sense of humour it's just a wonderful topic to be immersed in preparation for something like this. As Charles Spurgeon was, by all accounts, was unquestionably hilarious. Hilarious. However, for a lot of people that engage with Charles Spurgeon, I see a lot of you walking around tonight, that $15 sale for books has really whet your appetite. So I see walk around with Spurgeon sermons, right? Collection of sermons. That's a wonderful way to kind of get your feet wet in Spurgeon, in his world, in his theology, in his preaching, in his gospel centrality. But we're going to talk a little bit tonight about how the fact that very few people seem to have an appreciation or even any comprehension of just how incredibly humorous Charles Spurgeon was and how good a theologian / comedian / missionary he was. And a lot of that was actually Spurgeon's own doing. And we're going to look at why that is the case. So the subject that's set for me tonight, I'll give you the official title, Wit as Witness, Spurgeon's Humour in Missional Advance. So not just the broad theme of Charles Spurgeon, not even just the slightly narrower theme, Charles Spurgeon and humour, but even more particular, even more specific is Charles Spurgeon and his belief that humour was a missional tool. It was something to drive the edge of the advance of the kingdom of Christ. That will be my objective here this evening. So as you heard me introduce, my name's Craig. I serve here at Haddon as one of the lecturers, in fact the main lecturer. And at the moment, I've working on a larger research project. Many of you probably know I wrote a PhD dissertation on Charles Spurgeon recently, on Charles Spurgeon's use of charismatic revelatory gifts. Thank you. One person. That's always the case when you announce your doctoral dissertation. There's one person that even gets it, and even they hate it. But thank you for that. Thank you for that vote of support. I recently began working on a THD dissertation, and specifically on the question through the Sydney College of Divinity to look at Charles Spurgeon's strategic use of humour in his ministry. And that research I'm going to draw upon tonight in my two talks. This first one, as humour as a missional tool, and my second address a little bit later tonight will be how Spurgeon sees humour as a weapon. It's the edge of the sword in spiritual warfare. I'm going to give you a text, Philippians 4:4. Spurgeon loved this text. He cited it often when it comes to him defending his own sense of humour. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. I want to share just anecdotally where this particular subject matter began to resonate with me. A number of years ago, I was reading Spurgeon. I've been studying Spurgeon for a very long time, and I would make it a practice. I've done this for many years, reading a Spurgeon sermon about every Monday, every week as part of my day off. I've been pastoring, I'm planting churches, been pastoring in different parts of the world. Monday has been stereotypically my day off, and I read a Spurgeon sermon. And a number of years ago, there was a conference, a big name conference in America with some big celebrity guest speakers that, if I mention the name, everyone here would know exactly the conference and exactly the names of many of the regular speakers. And there was a particular speaker at this conference that was a famed biographer of Charles Spurgeon. So I was listening into the lectures, not live stream. This was maybe going back 2005, long before the modern advance of live streaming. And this Spurgeon biographer told a story about how Spurgeon was so profoundly appreciated as a man of just razor-sharp wit. And then this biographer said something that really piqued my interest. He said, But Spurgeon would look back upon that today and would feel regret that he so often, we might say in Australian lingo, he took the mickey, he had a go, he made fun of, he mocked, he jeered, he had a laugh. And I heard that and I thought to myself, would that be true? Would it be the case that Charles Spurgeon was a man so gifted with comedic timing and ability that he would look back now from glory in a heaven, would he look back at his earthly ministry, would he say, I probably could and should have toned it down? I wondered to myself whether that was true. And I wondered whether we could arrive at any kind of certainty around what Spurgeon believed was the strategic use of humour in not just missional advance, but as I said, strategic use of humour in spiritual warfare. So that commenced for me, at least that line of inquiry to research this and look at this. And I realized that when you really study Spurgeon in his own words and in his own belief structure around the use of humour, it was very strategic. It wasn't fly by the seat of his pants, drop a one-liner here, retort with a bit of jest over there. It was strategic. Now, one of the things we're going to do tonight together when I go through my presentation is I'm going to read a lot of Spurgeon. But here's what's going to happen. I've done a bit of build-up, haven't I? Spurgeon is hilarious, and you've believed it, I'm sure, I hope, right? And then I'm going to read Spurgeon, you're going to be like, I don't know, Craig, you kind of, I'm not getting it. Like the jokes are going to be hard to land nearly 200 years later, and I'm reading them. So I'm trying to put a bit of margin here between, I'm arguing that Spurgeon is hilarious. He believed he was. Everyone in his company believed he was. Everyone in his church believed he was. And I'm going to read you some of the zingers, right? And you're going to be like, it's kind of anticlimactic. So brace yourself. But let me give you Spurgeon in his own words. He would say this about jest and humour. He would say, I do believe in my heart that there may be as much holiness in a laugh as in a cry, and that sometimes to laugh is the better thing of the two. He would say, for I may weep and be murmuring and repining and thinking all sorts of bitter thoughts against God, while at another time I may laugh the laugh of sarcasm against sin, and so evince a holy earnestness in the defense of the truth. I do not know why ridicule is given up to Satan as his weapon to be used against us, and not to be employed by us as a weapon against him. I will venture to affirm, Spurgeon goes on, that the Reformation owed almost as much to the sense of the ridiculous in human nature as to anything else, and that those humorous squibs and caricatures that were issued by the friends of Luther did more to open the eyes of the Germans to the abomination of the priesthood than the more solid and ponderous arguments against Romanism. I know no reason why we should not, on suitable occasions, try the same style of reasoning. Even at a really young and early age. You see, Charles Spurgeon was a famed, globally renowned preacher even before he reached his mid-20s. In fact, the first published biography of Charles Spurgeon was when he was 23. Imagine getting to the ripe old age of 23, having done enough in your life that a preacher in America wrote and published a biography. Most of it was pretty scandalous and pretty incorrect, but Spurgeon was that much of a household name. And what happened in Spurgeon's early years, even while he was taking up pastoral calls to preach at Waterbeach and eventually New Park Street Chapel, Spurgeon would be invited throughout all of England to preach because he was a famed orator of gospel truth. People felt themselves moved under his preaching. One story is, he tells it in his autobiography, he went to preach at this particular church and they knew him by reputation only. And when he got there, the preacher of the church saw that he was but 18 years of age. In fact, Spurgeon mentions the man's name and the church. He says, Mr. Sutton of Cottonham had never seen me. I'm reading from Spurgeon's autobiography. But he'd heard that I was a popular young minister, so he invited me to preach. I'll paraphrase. I won't read too much of this because it'll get a bit dry. Spurgeon turns up. The old gentleman sees him and has almost a conniption, a heart attack. This preacher, this venerable old minister of the gospel, had founded and built this tremendous gospel work, and thought that he was inviting someone that had decades on them of gospel ministry, and this 18-year-old pup turns up. So the gentleman says, I might have to cancel the meeting, Spurgeon. I'm sorry to do this to you. I didn't realize you were but a child. I didn't realize you were but a kid. However, the gentleman decided, a crowd had turned up. Such was Spurgeon's reputation. So the meeting went ahead. Spurgeon, I'll put it back in his words now. Spurgeon says, after prayer and singing, I read from the book of Proverbs, the chapter that contained the words, the hoary head is a crown of glory, which means the grey hair. When I'd gone so far, Spurgeon, this is in his own words, I stopped and then I remarked, I doubt it, for this very morning I met with a man who had a hoary head, and yet he has not learned common civility to his fellow men. If I could translate that into modern parlance for you, Spurgeon, from this venerable minister's pulpit, calls him out in front of his whole church. You can imagine how awkward you might feel sitting in this particular meeting. And then Spurgeon proceeded with the reading. I finished with a verse. He says, if it be found in the way of righteousness. He says, I said, then there's another thing entirely. A hoary head would then be a crown of glory, and for the matter of that, so would a red head or a head of any other colour. I went on with the service. I preached as best I could. And as I came down from the pulpit, Mr. Sutton slapped me on the back and he exclaimed, bless your heart. I've been a minister for nearly 40 years, and I've never been so pleased with a sermon in all my life. But you are the sauciest dog that ever barked in a pulpit. Suffice to say, that became the title of my THC dissertation, the sauciest dog ever to bark in a pulpit. My supervisor wrote back and said, we might need to clarify what that means. This presentation will argue that Spurgeon was strategic. He believed that humour and jest and mockery and ridicule and any which way in which a good sense of well-timed, well-placed, delicately balanced good humour could advance the cause of Christ. The central argument is that Spurgeon's humour functioned not merely as a charming personality trait or a crowd-pleasing technique, but as a deliberate and sophisticated missional strategy, especially in the backdrop of severity of Victorian England sensibilities. When we think of Spurgeon, we often envision, rightly so, a theological giant, one who's known as the Prince of Preachers, who drew thousands to the Metropolitan Tabernacle on a weekly basis. Indisputably, all of that is true. However, as Michael Reeves aptly observes, he wrote a book on Spurgeon, a great book, he aptly observes that entirely upsetting the stereotypes of Victorian era, this was Spurgeon's ability to ripple a crowd with mirth. More importantly, compelling evidence suggests that even the writings of Spurgeon do not fully capture the vivacity and the wit of the man in person. His own dear friend William Williams famously exclaimed, "What a bubbling fountain of humour Mr. Spurgeon had! I have laughed more, I verily believe, when I'm in his company than the rest of my life besides." It wasn't a mere social pleasantry. It points to something more significant about Spurgeon's ministry and its unprecedented effectiveness. And let me talk a little bit about this. This section may come across a little dry, but we do have to, when dealing with academic research, talk about our methodological concerns. There are some. Before we proceed, we must address some crucial considerations. While his voluminous published sermons constitute an invaluable primary source, we must approach with critical discernment. You see, when we read Spurgeon's sermons, we're not reading the sermon per se. We're reading that which the stenographer took down as best as he could, and the sermon itself would go to Spurgeon's office, usually on a Monday. He dedicated about an hour or so to revising the sermon for the purpose of the press. And Spurgeon himself readily admits that in that act of redacting the sermons for the purpose of the press, he often had to shorten the sermon, sometimes by considerable length. And where he believed the shortening could be done at the most safest would be to pull out some of the one-liners and the anecdotes of jest. He didn't believe they would quite fly off the page to the reader as well as they landed, you might say, in the real live environment of a preaching moment. So Spurgeon himself meticulously edited these sermons every Monday for publication, And he candidly acknowledged the implications of the process. In fact, in his book, Lectures to My Students, I'll read this from Spurgeon. He said, "My spoken discourses have more," that means his sermons, right, or lectures, "my spoken discourses have more of what some critics call dolce," he meant sweetness, "and less of utile," he means usefulness, "than my published works. The reporters," Spurgeon goes on, "as a general rule, give more of the serious argument and less of the illustrative pleasantry." So to do this research takes a lot of delicate and balanced analysis. Because what's interesting is because you can read a sermon published by the newspaper, printed in one of these wonderful volumes all around you on Spurgeon's published sermons. You can read it, and then you can read the responses in primary source literature of people that were there. And you read people talking about, "I went to Spurgeon's church today." And people would write things like, "Even the way he moved his body had the entire 5,000 large crowd in stitches of laughter." How do you represent that in a written sermon? Or they would say the tone he used to articulate. Spurgeon had this unique knack of being able to mock someone just by saying their name a certain way, or talking about a certain theological error in a certain way, or just a specific tone. We've lost all of that in the public published sermons of Spurgeon. This is a crucial admission. The published sermon record, while foundational to our understanding of who Spurgeon was and what he preached, also represents it also presents a systematically understated picture of his actual humorous rhetoric. That's problematic. So to address this limitation, my own research methodology employs what I call a multi-source verification approach. While the published sermons remain the cornerstone, they have to be, I've systematically supplemented their analysis with evidence from contemporary periodicals, the attendees' own diaries, personal letters. People would write to family and friends, "I went to see Spurgeon on Sunday." And these people were a lot less sensitive to just writing out Spurgeon's jokes, his humours, his bodily posture, his gesticulation. His editorial writings, like the Sword and the Trowel, and his more spontaneous lectures and correspondence. This methodological triangulation is essential for reconstructing a broader and fuller understanding of how humour actually functioned as his missional tool. Spurgeon lectures to his students in preaching the gospel and allowing the arrow of the truth of the gospel to pierce the armour of people that walk into church on Sundays. You've seen these types of people. They're either, they're kind of coerced to be there by believing spouse or believing family, or they just go out of obligation maybe, and they're not really there to listen or to bow the knee to Christ or confess his lordship. Spurgeon would say to his students, the best tool of all is as he sits there in his plated armour and he's all gritted his teeth and clenching his fist, and he's just got to get through the service. He's the most recalcitrant listener that there could be. Spurgeon says, if you drop a joke and you see him smile, the plate of the armour is lifted. Send the arrow of truth in. Spurgeon believed it could disarm. It could ingratiate hearers to the speaker if they could feel endeared to him. And in many ways, Spurgeon utilized his tremendous giftedness to endear his hearers. But of course, this all comes against the backdrop of the Victorian homiletical landscape. Fancy word for saying, what was the Victorian view of the function of preaching? A wall of solemnity. To appreciate the radical nature of Spurgeon's approach, we must first understand the prevailing Victorian homiletical landscape. It was an era largely characterized by what historian Brian Hilton terms a theology of earnestness. An unwavering solemnity was widely regarded as an only appropriate mode of sacred discourse. Of course, in fact, we're just about to hear a fantastic talk from Dr. Sam Waldron on the place of gravity and solemnity. But when that becomes the only means of any kind of sacred discourse, then it is a weakened discourse. Hudson Taylor mentions this. Interestingly, he's a contemporary of Spurgeon. I think he's born 2 years before Spurgeon, 1832. Spurgeon's born 1834. Hudson Taylor wrote this. Hudson Taylor says, I may say that it was not uncommon in those days to call conversion becoming serious. He said, and judging by the face of some of the professors, those that profess Jesus, it appears to be a very serious matter indeed. Would it not be well if the people of God had always telltale faces evincing the blessedness and the gladness of salvation so clearly that unconverted people would start to call conversion becoming joyful instead of becoming serious? This conviction that Hudson Taylor points to, and of course Spurgeon was deeply sensitive toward, this cultural kind of, this milieu of understanding that anything sacred or religious or gospel related or anything Jesus themed has got to be deeply solemn and profoundly gravitas and all, even morose, rested on several theological foundations. I'm going to race through these because I know I'm already out of time and I'm only getting through my introduction. Profound emphasis on divine transcendence. Number 2, heavy emphasis on human depravity. It's all good, it's all true. 3rd, an implicit theology of revelation that privileged formal, elevated language as the only fitting attire for sacred truth. I would say that Spurgeon reserved his most satirical remarks for what he believed to be professional formalism. He loved to stand up, especially in his pastor's college with his students, and just satirically just mock them. He'd put on their voices. He'd stand like he's dressed in their rigid, tight jacket robes, the official clergy of the church. Spurgeon loved to mock and jeer. And yet in Victorian England, there's more Baxter than there is Luther. Let me give you from Richard Baxter. And Spurgeon loved Richard Baxter. Baxter says in his Reformed pastor, of all the preaching in the world that speaks not stark lies, I hate that preaching which tendeth to make the hearers laugh, or to move their mind by tickling levity and affect them as stage players used to do. This was pervasive in Spurgeon's day, this belief that anything respecting the gospel and the church and the mission of Christ ought to be only and deeply solemn. So, let's look at Spurgeon's theological counterstatement, holy cheerfulness. It was precisely against this backdrop that Spurgeon's approach emerged as a vibrant, deliberate counterstatement, a rebuttal, if you will. He directly challenged the prevailing notion that God's majesty precluded joy or accessibility in worship. This was key. In The Sword and the Trowel, that's Spurgeon's monthly periodical or bi-monthly periodical, he posed this rhetorical question. He said, God's terrible majesty I acknowledge, but is he not also our Father? And has he forbidden his children to smile in his presence? Are we to come before him only with fear and never with joy? Is the laughing cherub an anomaly in heaven? Spurgeon's asking rhetorically. He believed heaven was mostly laughing cherubs. And heaven for you and I, the redeemed, is joy. This wasn't mere rhetorical flourish. It represented a sophisticated theological argument grounded in several key principles. Let's look at what these principles are together. Firstly, the biblical foundation. Spurgeon regularly cited, I already have done this evening, Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord, always, again, I will say rejoice. Scriptural mandate for Christian cheerfulness. In his 1864 sermon, The Christian's Heaviness and Rejoicing, Spurgeon articulated this. Let me read to you in Spurgeon. He says, the command to rejoice is found throughout Scripture, and I cannot dismiss it as optional. Rejoice in the Lord always is as much a divine command as thou shalt not steal. If God commands his people to rejoice, shall I, his minister, adopt a manner so somber and a countenance so gloomy so as to contradict by my appearance the very message I deliver? No, I will demonstrate the joy I proclaim. Secondly, theological anthropology. Spurgeon developed a theological anthropology, his doctrine of man, his doctrine of humanity, positioned humour as part of God's redemptive design. In his 1876 sermon, Mirth and the Man of Sorrows, Spurgeon said this, that man has the faculty of laughter. That man is evidence that God intended him to laugh. The capacity distinguishes humans from the beasts, and so it must have purpose in divine design. Sin has corrupted this faculty, like all others, and it turns wholesome laughter into mere frivolity or cruel mockery, but Christ came to redeem the whole man, including the capacity for mirth. Sanctified humour is not opposed to godliness, but is rather godliness expressed through God-given faculty. The third one, incarnational methodology. So, perhaps most radically, Spurgeon understood humour as incarnational communication. In a striking passage in an 1875 lecture on conversion as our aim, he compared his rhetorical approach to Christ's incarnation. Spurgeon said this: "When the eternal Word becomes flesh, deity condescends to human limitations without compromising divine truth. The incarnation translated the infinite into finite terms, making the transcendent accessible without diminishment. So too must the preacher translate eternal truths into forms accessible for ordinary hearers. Sometimes this requires the translator's art in finding equivalent expressions, and humour often serves as the most effective translation of lofty truths into the vernacular of common experience." Spurgeon loved this. Spurgeon loved this not just in his oratory, in his preaching. He loved this in everyday life. He tells a story of walking down one of the busy streets of London one day, and the traffic, all the horse-drawn carts, and it's just bedlam, it's a mess. And he's walking down this footpath, and you have to imagine in Victorian England, footpaths were not the at least somewhat sanitary they might appear today. They were ghastly scenes of sewage and trash, everything you can imagine. Spurgeon's walking down, and as he's walking down the footpath, he nearly runs into a delivery man. Delivery man would be on maybe the back of the horses, or sometimes on bicycles as they were evolving into kind of messenger vehicles. And Spurgeon says this man nearly ran him right off the road. The man jumped off. He apologized. "I'm so sorry, sir. I nearly knocked you over." Spurgeon said, "Don't worry about it. Enjoy your day." And the man said, "I'll tell you something about my day. I've been at this for hours, and not one good-hearted fellow has offered me a beer." Spurgeon took that story, that particular occasion, went to his pastor's college and talked to his students about why are those in the world so gifted at turning conversation to their objectives and their endeavours, and we're always so awkward. We're always so awkward. We want to go from soccer or state of origin to the fires of hell. We're so awkward. Spurgeon believed that humour was the key. Use humour as your key. So it's missional strategy with 5 key functions. I'm going to race through these as quick as I can. Firstly, democratizes theological discourse. Humour is the great leveller. Consistently broke down educational and class barriers that typically surrounded theological discourse. There's a famous interaction of newlywed couples at Mentone. Spurgeon loved, just about more than anything else, a really well-placed, timed practical joke. Loved it. And he's at Mentone, which is the south of France. Warm beaches, beautiful climate. A lot of people would go to get married there every year, but Spurgeon lived, toward the end of his life, a lot of his time there because the climate was best for his ailing health. And he got in the newspaper, he got an article reading of a wedding that had occurred and all the particulars of the wedding. So Spurgeon has an interaction with a newlywed couple at Mentone, this famous French resort. He joyfully claimed to know all their wedding details. He pretended that he had some kind of premonition. And he began to recite, "Missus, if I was a young lady going to get married, I should wear a white silk dress with lace and a veil of orange blossoms, and I should have all my 6 bridesmaids in blue, pale, white, and pale blue and white hats with..." And he went on and on and on. He described the silver tea, he described the settings, everything, even the piano. The bride exclaimed, astonished, "Oh, that's exactly what we did." Spurgeon enjoyed a moment of laughter, then just revealed, it's in the newspaper, I read it yesterday. There's an even more amusing story of Spurgeon who would often, when young men would come into London from the outer regions, the rural parts of England, to enroll in his minister's college, Spurgeon, as busy as he was, always volunteered to take them in his cart around London to give them a tour of the city. And this story is true. All the young men got up on the back of the cart. Spurgeon always sat at the front with the driver, and they all began to light up their pipes and their cigars. Maybe half an hour into this tour, Spurgeon's pointing out this and that and this other thing and this street and that road and that river and that building. He turns around and he sees all these gentlemen smoking their pipes and their cigars. He says, "Are you not ashamed to be smoking tobacco in the presence of such an esteemed Baptist minister?" And they all, as you can imagine, promptly began stuffing out their pipes and quickly, putting it. At the moment everything was out, Spurgeon pulled out his big cigar, lit it up. And they said, what are you doing, Mr. Spurgeon? He says, I just asked if you're ashamed. I'm not. An amusing episode in the life of Spurgeon. This approach consistently made complex theological concepts and even awkward social interactions much easier, much more fluent, much more comprehensive. I've got a bunch of quotes here I'm going to skip past. The second one, building authentic connection and trust. Spurgeon frequently employed self-deprecating humour that simultaneously established his authenticity and embodied theological humility. When addressing the common confusion about conversion, let me read you what Spurgeon says. I speak on conversion with the comfortable knowledge of being an expert on the subject, having myself been converted at least a dozen times. Or at least, he says, I thought so. I can recollect that time when I was converted as a child and later on when I became a young man, and he goes on to recite his actual conversion story. He happily, almost greedily self-deprecates. Now remember, you're talking about a guy that is the fame of the world in evangelicalism. He gladly self-deprecates for the purpose of leveling the playing field with his hearers. This opening created immediate identification with audience members. Some of you even here tonight, you got saved, maybe in kind of modern evangelistic setting, you answered altar calls for 6 months, maybe. Some of you think back, when did I get saved? It's hard when I get asked that because when I was 5 and then 15 and then, I lived like the devil till I was 28. And then Spurgeon's just giving you permission to see him as an ordinary fellow. Number 3, disarming resistance and opposition. Spurgeon's humour proved remarkably effective at disarming resistance to the gospel message. When one doubter came into his church, he challenged biblical miracles. So during an 1856 sermon, Spurgeon said, this gentleman challenged him privately. Spurgeon's now in front of 5,000 people in church. And he says to this guy, well, you wear the spectacles of unbelief, sir, and you see nothing but fog. Take them off. Try faith's clear glasses, and you'll see Christ walking on the waves. Miracles are not myths when viewed with the eyes of trust. Spurgeon very much enjoyed making fun of this gentleman, who we believe took it in good humour, challenging him with the reality of biblical miracles. This response demonstrates how Spurgeon employed humour not to dismiss opposition, but to reframe it constructively. The documented positive responses from the doubter who returned for subsequent services, I don't know if any of us would do that, called out in front of 5,000 people, suggest that this approach effectively communicated divine truth, making difficult truths palatable. Number 4. We've already addressed this at least in some respect. Even when addressing challenging theological concepts, Spurgeon's humour made them more accessible, explaining difficult Reformed doctrines of limited atonement and election. I'll read you this one quote. Spurgeon says, a poor simpleton once said, if the Lord had only put a ticket on the elect so that we might know them, it'd be a big E sticking off the ear or something, it would then be so very convenient. Spurgeon says, well, indeed it would. But what would be the use of it? We should then only begin fighting over that E. And we should want to get our neighbours off and others of a select list on. When you read neighbours, you should have heard mother-in-law. Right? That's the contemporary version of that. Depend upon it, God's mode of management is always best. And he had the place in stitches. The most hilarious thing. This humorous illustration made a potentially alienating doctrine approachable by highlighting the practical wisdom behind divine mystery. Number 5, created memorable teaching moments. Spurgeon consistently used humour to create what modern educators call sticky learning experiences. His famous pun jokes. This is where me and Spurgeon don't see eye to eye. I can't stand pun. My wife loves it, employs it all the time. She's the dad joke machine in our house. Me, I must be off the reservation. Spurgeon loved pun. There's this story when he was asked, what colour ink should your marriage vows be written in? The story is Spurgeon went away. He loved riddles. He went away, he meditated, he thought, sometimes for some period of time, maybe weeks. He came back to the person and asked him, said, I don't know, you've got to tell me, it's keeping me awake at night. What colour ink do we write our marriage vows in? And the man said, in violet. Spurgeon exclaimed with great joy and rapturous laughter, "That is a capital conundrum. It's both wit and wisdom, for a marriage vow must be inviolate, unable to be inviolated, pure and unbroken." The funny thing is, we can tell that Spurgeon went and told that joke to everyone he knew for the next 20 years. It keeps coming up. And like all good preachers, it's only about a year or two before he starts claiming it as his own. That's what I always say. I'll tell someone else's story the first time. I'll say, "Oh, so-and-so says this." Right? The second time I'll say, "Well, as you've once before heard me say." Third time, it's mine. It's mine. Spurgeon was much the same. The wordplay illuminated theological truth about marriage fidelity through an unexpected linguistic connection. Spurgeon loved puns. The evidence of cross-class recognition. We're going to skip past this. We're out of time. We're out of time. It's fascinating to look at the ways in which different strata of society appreciate it. As you can imagine, the highest class, the aristocracy, the wealthy, the upper class people of London, they thought he was nothing but a buffoon, and they called him so. The middle class, they thought it was good fun. But the lower class had this tremendous reception. Let me give you one of these quotes. I've just got to find it here because I'm skipping past so much. Working class embrace. Working class embrace. Responses were overwhelmingly positive. Factory worker Thomas Broadbent's diary entry captures it perfectly. He says, "First sermon on conversion that made sense to ordinary folk." The pattern reveals that Spurgeon had the capacity to communicate to the lowest classes of people. In fact, not only that, but in Victorian England and among all their social sensibilities, women responded tremendously to this. Let me read you from the Christian Ladies magazine. Observe this. "Mr. Spurgeon, unlike many preachers who address the ladies with their excessive sentimentality or patronizing simplicity," you should hear mansplaining, "Spurgeon speaks to us with the same intellectual respect as he accords gentlemen." It was interesting to look at denominational differences as well. Of course, the high church, the high Anglicans, saw Spurgeon again as nothing more than an entertainer, irreverent, sacrilegious. But as you get down to those denominations that were most missional and most engaged in the Great Commission, they adored it. Let me close out. The theological implications. Joy as gospel truth. What emerges from this analysis is more than a study of rhetorical technique. It's a window into Spurgeon's theological understanding of the gospel. For Spurgeon, genuine Christian faith was fundamentally about the restoration of joy, and this he would passionately preach. He says, man was not originally made to mourn, he was made to rejoice. And now that Jesus has come to restore the ruins from the fall, he has come to bring back to us the old joy. Only it shall be even sweeter and deeper than it ever had been before lost. This theological foundation informed his conviction that happiness was, in Spurgeon's words, a vital component of the Christian life, one that should be both possessed and displayed. He says this, it is a very vulgar error to suppose that a melancholy countenance is the index of a gracious heart. I commend cheerfulness to anyone who would win souls. There are more flies caught with honey than with vinegar. There are more souls led to heaven by a man who wears heaven on his face than by a man who bears Tartarus in his looks. And so we look then to contemporary implications. First, distinction between holy cheerfulness and general levity provides a framework for discerning when humour is just humour for the sake of being irreverent. I don't believe that's Spurgeon's concern. I believe Spurgeon's humour is tactical. Second, his incarnational understanding of communication. Humour as translation of lofty truths into the vernacular of common experience. And third, the cross-cultural effectiveness suggests that principles for identifying which aspects of communicative approach serve universal human needs versus cultural specifics. Conclusion. We got there. I know you're thinking, gee, how long is this guy going to go on for? Conclusion. You're in for a treat because I'm back later. So this is round one. The extensive documentation reveals his humour was more than a personality quirk or a crowd-pleasing technique. It was a sophisticated missional strategy grounded in deep theological conviction about the nature of the gospel itself. His holy cheerfulness challenged the theological classism of Victorian religious culture. Spurgeon understood intuitively what modern communication theory has already since confirmed, that how we communicate the gospel shapes how hearers understand the gospel. His humour didn't compromise his reformed convictions. It made them more accessible, more understandable. It didn't trivialise divine truth. It translated it into forms that ordinary people had the capacity to grasp and embrace. In Spurgeon's hands, wit becomes witness. Humour becomes a herald of hope. Laughter becomes a ladder for those seeking to climb from earthly despair to heavenly joy. Spurgeon's legacy reminds us that the gospel, properly understood and winsomely communicated, is not merely good advice, it's genuinely good news. It's news that makes people laugh and rejoice with delight and weep with gratitude. There's one particular hearer, working class man, went and heard Spurgeon's sermon. He wrote one line in response. He said, "Wept once, laughed twice, left resolving to repent." As we face challenges today of communicating the eternal truths across our own native landscape, Spurgeon's model of sanctified humour offers inspiration and instruction. His bubbling fountain of humour, as someone called him, a bubbling fountain of humour, it's certainly a fat joke, you didn't get it, I'll help you out, was never merely about entertainment, it was about invitation. Opening doors beyond formal solemnity and ensuring that the call of Christ, "Come unto me all you who weary and are heavy laden, and I give rest." This is the enduring power of wit as witness. It reveals that God who commands us to rejoice, God who commands us to savour every good gift, also gives us this gift of laughter to lighten our hearts. Thank you. Looking forward to our next talk on Spurgeon, humour as a sword of warfare. God bless.